So Gary Chapman was a mental health counselor. He was also a pastor who back in the 1990s began to notice patterns in couples he was counseling, marriage counseling. And he began to see that couples were more often than not misunderstanding each other's needs. And he wrote a modest book at the time in which he identified the various ways people receive and the various ways people express love in their relationships. And he wrote the book to help couples understand these differences and needs. That book became a bestseller and is titled The 5 Love Languages. Who's heard of this before? Good. But Chapman identified these 5 languages. Let's see if I can remember them. I have them written down here so I don't forget them. There's words of affirmation. There's a love language of quality of time. There's a love language of physical touch, a love language of acts of service, and a love language of receiving gifts. And his point was that people have different ways of expressing their love and usually feel loved when love is expressed to them in that similar way. So for one example, one person expresses affection through spoken words, through praise, or through appreciation, a note of appreciation. They enjoy these kind words and encouragement and love notes and cute text messages. They feel loved. While another, their love language may be around physical touch as their primary love language, where they feel loved when their partner holds their hand, touches their arm, gives them a massage at the end of the day. Different ways, the point is, to express love and different expectations about our feeling loved. And Chapman argued that it's important to understand your partner's primary love language. I mean, we all appreciate and express love language in different ways, but we tend to have one primary love language, and your partner, you should be aware of your partner's primary love language and communicate to each other how to express our love and what we need in order for us to feel loved. And I thought of that insight. When I read our text this morning. I thought of that idea of different kinds of love language. It's evident, we should understand from different parts of the Gospels that Mary and Martha, along with their brother Lazarus, were some of the closest friends of Jesus. They are his adopted family, if you will. It's not the family he was born with, but the one he made. And Jesus intentionally and specifically comes to see his closest friends, Mary and Martha. And so it's obvious, I thought of that 5 languages, that Martha expresses her love for Jesus through acts of service, welcoming him into her home. And while Mary, on the other hand, her primary language we might understand is of quality time, where we are told she sits down at his feet and listens to him. And as the story unfolds, Martha complains to Jesus and tries to, let's be honest, triangulate him in scolding Mary that she's not helped with all the work. And I will be honest, I'm much more a Martha than I am a Mary. I identify with Martha this morning as my primary love language is like hers, a kind of acts of service. Now, at the risk of sharing too much information, it is not an uncommon occurrence in my household that my wife will complain to me to quit doing the dishes and come sit down as she shares her day with me. Now, a shallow interpretation of this story might emphasize, in some interpretations throughout history, has emphasized the gender roles, in that the traditional expectation of women is primarily being about cooking and cleaning rather than any other role. I must be honest, growing up, that's often how my mom expressed acts of love, was that she cooked and cleaned and was in the kitchen and worked in that way. I'm reminded, though, of Margaret Atwood's book. Has everybody read The Handmaid's Tale? It's this very dystopian vision of the future in which men control women. And what's interesting detail in that book is that the infertile women who are unable to give birth are forced to be servants who do all the cleaning, all the cooking, and for the ruling class of men. Now, do you know what they were called? They were called Marthas. The truth is that this story turns the very idea of gender roles upside down, if you really understand it. In fact, the story at the time, the listeners of the story might have actually been a little scandalized. We're not, but at the time they might have been a little scandalized of the simple fact that while Martha, the expected role to cook and clean and get everything to welcome, Mary sits at the feet of Jesus. Now, part of that doesn't sound too scandalous to us this day, but back then, this was a traditional rabbinic image in Judaism where disciples sit at the feet of the rabbi. So Mary taking that role of being a disciple, unheard of in that time, a woman taking that role, indicative of Jesus' ministry, of his perspective, where a woman could be a disciple equal to that of a man, despite what the Southern Baptist Convention says today. A surface reading of the text might also think that Jesus is taking Martha to task. And I guess you could hear a tone for that. Taking Martha to task for her busily serving rather than the more, as some interpretations have and lift up Mary, a more worthy, contemplative choice of just being present to Jesus. But I want to point out that Jesus in the story does not criticize Martha for her choice of service, and let's say loving in the way she is most comfortable, but instead wisely points out something about how she does her work. If it didn't jump out at you if you read the story, it would be very easy to notice that at 3 different times we learn that Martha is distracted and worried and troubled. The Greek word here for worried and distracted and troubled is an image of a divided mind that is expressed in outward actions. Jesus' teaching is not that Mary is better for having to choose to sit at the feet of Jesus as opposed to Martha's acts of welcome and hospitality, but that Mary has the better part because she is not distracted and worried. Martha, he says, Martha, why are you worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed? Indeed, only one. So, the meaning of this to me, or what strikes me, is the point is not a critique of Martha for her actions, but for that divided mind, if you will, where she is distracted and worried. Instead, he teaches her that there's really only one thing needed to be holy and fully present in the one thing we are doing, whether that one thing we are doing is housework or sitting at the feet of Jesus. Jesus is proposing the better part is being solely present in the moment, whatever Martha or Mary does. Be at peace, be one, be present in whatever you do. This is the better part. Now, I don't know about you, but I can fully identify with Martha. I kind of live my life sometimes like an old bumper sticker, my favorite bumper sticker that says, Jesus is coming, look busy, right? And I find myself distracted, worried. I don't know about y'all, in the midst of my own busyness. And the truth is, I'm like Martha. Rather than being fully present in the moment, I am distracted by worries, by many things. Am I doing it right? Why aren't others helping me? My common complaint. Why isn't my wife helping me, right? Am I being judged? Are they better than me? These divided mind, in a way, is all these judgments and self-judgments and recriminations. Most of us probably could relate to Mary's distraction and anxiety when we are distracted by guilt or by resentment, by sadness, by bitterness, by unforgiveness. We are divided, separated from our true selves and separated from God. There was a man who lived in the early 17th century in France. Nicholas Herman was his name. And Nicholas Herman was born to peasant parents. So it was a very reality you could imagine in the 17th century, living as a peasant. He had very limited options for schooling, so instead he joined the French army. This was in the midst of the 30-year war between France and England. And he joined the army because it guaranteed him meals and a small stipend. That's a way he could survive. And during his time in the army, Nicholas had an experience in the midst of the fighting and the war. He had this experience that set him on a unique spiritual journey. At the age of 16, he was 16, serving in the army, in the midst of a battlefield, he came upon this leafless tree, stripped and bare. And he had this amazing experience, this amazing realization that in a few months, even after all this war and destruction, in a few months, that tree would be full leaf and flower. And he saw that tree as a symbol of God's ability to transform our human heart, sometimes barren, sometimes broken in the midst of the battlefield of life, and yet God can make our souls fully leaf and flower. And after being severely injured in a battle, Nicholas left the army and did various things to try to survive, but eventually he felt called to become a lay brother in a Carmelite monastery on the outskirts of Paris. He took on the name Brother Lawrence. Now, he was not an educated person. He was rather gruff, and many people commented about his rough exterior, and because of his lack of education, he was assigned to work in the kitchen where he washed dishes. And that's what he did, was wash the dishes, a lowly dishwasher. And despite that, the low position, his character, who he was, attracted many people to come to him, and he began to have a reputation for expressing and experiencing a profound, deep inner peace and holiness. And he began to share the wisdom. He was often surprised when people would come to him because he was a humble man simply seeking to live in God. But people began to hear about this humble lay brother at the Carmelite monastery who washed dishes, and he began to share his wisdom and his understanding, and he passed on that wisdom to others in conversations and in letters. And he began to gain this reputation, and people were amazed by this holy man and these observations, these comments were recorded and became the basis of a book that is titled The Practice of the Presence of God. That is considered a classic in spiritual literature. Brother Lawrence practiced the presence of God in whatever he was doing. And he taught that. He focused on being present to God, to love God profoundly. He actually took pleasure, I know this is hard to imagine, he actually took pleasure in cleaning the pots and pans because he saw those acts as prayers and a way to love God. And Brother Lawrence would plead that all work is valuable to God, and one needs not accomplish great things to please God. He argues that in the midst of the moment our soul, we would be surprised of the conversation between our soul and God. So I invite you the next time you clean your dishes to practice the presence of God. To God be the glory this day and forevermore.